Hi, my name is Andy Kirk, and welcome to Season 1 of Explore Explain. This is a podcast and video series all about data visualization design. In each episode, I have conversations with designers and developers to explore in depth the hidden thinking behind their visualization projects. I'll be asking them to explain the what, the why, and the how of their design process. We have some great guests, some wonderful projects to learn about, so let's jump straight into today's episode.
In this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Nadia Bremer. Nadia, thank you very much for giving up your time today. Can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Sure. So I am a freelancing data visualization designer working under the name of Visual Cinnamon, and I studied astronomy. Then I became a data scientist, and now I'm a database freelancer. I live in Amsterdam and have been living in the Netherlands for a while. And I like creating, I guess, the more marketing-based, a little bit more like handcrafted and unique kinds of data visualizations.
Super duper. Well, thank you very much for giving up your time today. We're going to go into the hidden thinking, the behind-the-scenes story of a project you worked on called Alice Depth Circles, which you worked on in January of 2019. To begin with, can you just introduce the project and give a little overview of what this is that we are seeing?
Yes. So the visualization reveals the underlying sort of hierarchical structure of a network of services where there are parent services which can call children services, and they can call other children services. So it's an entire network of things running in something like an operating system. And the visualization kind of reveals the state of how things are going. Is something failing? And if something is failing, how is the cascade of fails running through the system? Is something running? Is something finished? So that's the main thing that it does.
To start the conversation, let's trace it right back to the origin story of this work. This was a client project you worked on rather than a personal passion project. Can you just give me a sense of the sort of background to how this client approached you and what their initial pitch to you was in terms of what they wanted to work on?
Yeah, so they reached out to me maybe a few months before January, but then I was fully booked, so I couldn't take it on. And they had seen another one of my projects that I did for data sketches called Royal Constellations, in which I visualized the family tree of 3,000 people connected to European royal families. And they thought that their data set would fit that particular kind of setup of how the abstract structure was of that visualization, that it would fit their data perfectly. So they reached out to me, asked me, like, if we send you our data set, do you also think that this would work well? And if yes, would you actually create a version for us? So that's how it kind of how the ball got rolling.
Interesting. I mean, I've also had experience working with clients who come to you with almost like an established idea, and they're going to ask you to sort of fit the data into that idea, and it can be quite a difficult conversation to manage and to manage expectations and to say, no, that won't work. We need to go down a different route. How did you sort of get from them a conversation about kind of taking a step back from there by saying, okay, rather than say, here's an idea, make this, did they have any underlying curiosities that this thing would hopefully serve to answer for them and obviously the users that it was intended for?
Yes. So in the way that they presented it, and I held a first sort of client call during which they really guided me through the data set that they had. They really showed me, like, this is what there is, and this is the underlying variables that you'll have, and this is the things. And the way they explained it, I did feel that using at least the same abstract form as the Royal Constellations project was actually a good way to start. It might actually work. Which is true. I don't often have that because data sets are always different. But I thought it could be a good place to at least start from. But I did also tell them that every data set is different, so probably we'll need to update some things. I mean, even disregarding any kind of client style guides that there were. But I guess in that sense, it was. I did really just keep that as the sort of starting off point.
Yeah, and if we think about the general circumstances of the projects that you're going to work on, so the kind of contextual factors, the freedoms, the frictions that you're working to, you've spoken there about the client, and these are obviously the stakeholders in the work.
Mhm.
Were they very much about seeking you to be the expert about visualization, saying, look, can you create this for us? Or did they want to have kind of frequent input and feedback iterations? Were they very much respecting you as the expert on what will be the best solution, will be the best solution?
Yes, actually, I felt that throughout the project progressing, they felt that more and more. It's like they came to me with the start with the idea that, oh, we have this data set, we think this will work, can you just merge the two? But once the project progressed and I showed them, well, eventually, not really a spoiler, but it didn't actually work for that. And I started explaining other things and creating new versions. At every point, they were more and more like, okay, so we trust what you're doing and we agree with that. I always have a very back and forth kind of relationship with the client. Well, not teeny tiny, but I make like medium changes and I immediately send it back to them and ask, like, this is where it's going right now. Is it still in the right direction for you as well? So that's almost natural to me. But here it was really more of a, oh, we like what you're doing, or here's the answer to this particular question that you had, and then that's kind of how that progressed.
Great. With regards to the intended audience that this was for, obviously
Yeah.
it was a client project, so there's a sense of it's for internal users. Did it have multiple intended personas, or was this quite definable at this early stage?
This was actually a tricky one because there were two types of personas that it needed to be created for. It was actually funny how they phrased that part. Let me see. I actually made a screenshot of that so I could read it. So they said to me, like, we want you to create this visualization so we can use it for management purposes. So is their system running well? How are the dependencies of the different services? Is there metadata available? So really to help their internal team understand the system on a really detailed basis. But then they said, well, we also want to use the same visualization for marketing purposes and put it on our main website. So it should be in line with their brand and a general audience. Maybe they shouldn't be able to get what it actually shows, but there should be some sort of visual appeal to it that makes people want to look at it. So that made it pretty tricky.
That's a tricky chasm to bridge, really.
Yep.
So obviously I guess the intention there, apart from the external marketing aesthetic appeal side of things, for the users, these would largely be domain knowledgeable people who know what this is about and know what they're looking for.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
Right.
experts.
Okay. In terms of other contextual factors, what were the timescales that were established in terms of the not just the expected deadlines that they imposed on you, but also did you have at this stage a sense of how long this would take? 'Cause I always find that the hardest thing to equate. Before you get into this, you don't really know, is this a big job, a small job, quick or simple? How did you kind of rationalize that challenge?
It was actually thankfully there was no actual really hard deadline on this project. So in terms of like lead time, I could take as long as I want, but of course there was a certain budget which equates to a certain number of hours that I figured it would take, which I'm always very, very bad at figuring out. I tried to think of how long Royal Constellations had taken me, and then kind of going from there and seeing what other things they wanted. They wanted some extra interactive functionalities, and again, basing that on previous projects, trying to figure out how long that would take and over how many weeks I could actually balance that compared to my the other projects that I had at that time. So I think in terms of like actually working on it, it took place across about 2 months of me after I received the first data set to actually build it out completely.
And this is a thing that I'd cover at the end of the conversation, but looking back, do you feel that your estimates up front were fairly in line with how much time you did spend on it?
Yes and no. It's actually up front we had like 4 phases where I would make it according to this plan, and then I would add interactivity, and then I would add maybe some sort of subtle animations. And then it turned out that the initial design wasn't working, so actually I went back to the client and I said maybe we can restructure the phases, and I add a design phase at the start, and we take off that last phase of the subtle animations and see where it goes from there. Maybe we'll need some extra budget at the end. So actually the restructuring of the phases turned out to be a really good guess, but I think that's mostly just luck, and not due to my actually really understanding all the challenges ahead.
So in a sense, it sounds like although things might have changed, it was more of a reallocation rather than an extended task, as it were.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a digital product, but that does not mean it's a straightforward singular task. How did you need to create something that would work for both desktop, laptop, mobile, tablet, and is it a solution that does try and fit all those different platforms?
Now, thankfully, this was something that was really only meant for larger screens, so laptop or desktop. And for mobile, I didn't have to make any kind of adjustments. So even though it was going to be on their front page, the visual, it was fine if everything was so small that you couldn't really read anything out of it, because again, it was more on the sort of the visual appeal side. So I could really, I told them at the start that if you want something that works on mobile as well, that puts constraints on me on what I can make for you that works well on desktop. And they were very adamant, like everybody will be using this on big screens, so please use all the real estate that you need.
And I mean, we'll come on to some more detail in the data section shortly, but it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this was intended as a one-off development, but a one-off development that would need to accommodate as much future variation in data shape and size as possible. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. We'll cover technology again later on, in terms of the tools that you use and the technologies that you were employing. You mentioned before about design. The aesthetics had to be a key part of this with regards to it being in a sense, a marketing asset as well as a monitoring management tool. Clearly, I guess that meant that you had to accommodate with certain corporate design guidelines around colour, typefaces. Is that the case, and to what extent did that inhibit your options?
Yes, they had a very nicely created style guide, which was interesting to see on the. Usually, I quickly go to the brand colors slide, and here that was just black, white, and red.
Which
well,
that limits things, I guess. But I suppose it's nice at least up front to have that sense of, okay, here are the boundaries, and I'll work, do my best within there.
Yeah.
And we've spoken about the purpose to be this sort of very difficult double-edged sword. This idea of both being a monitoring and an aesthetic vehicle, and I think it's remarkable how you've managed to harmonise those two. Did you ever feel that you were inevitably going to have to lean towards one or the other, or do you feel that ultimately what you arrived at was this perfect harmony of the two?
I think for me it was always most important to have it be like an effective visualization for the people actually working with it. And then I felt that once, in more in terms of the visual form, I felt like if I have the abstract like data encoding that is working well to reveal the insights, then I'll try and use the design, so more subtle things that maybe aren't necessarily having to do anything with the data, but things like adding a glow or the use of color. I will use that to try and make it more visually appealing. So it was really driven by the former, and then seeing after I got that working, how to make that marketing side work as well.
Right, and that's absolutely the most responsible way forward. Get the thing working, and then can we squeeze out any further elegance, aesthetics, visual appeal, and if so, fantastic. You spoke already about how the client came to you with this notion of inspiration from the Constellations project. Beyond that, were there any other initial ideas or other projects that you thought you could seek to emulate that gave you a broader landscape of initial concepts, structures, archetypes, metaphors?
No, for this particular project, that's really what we started with, what I started with. I really felt like I'll see how that comes about, and only after that, and when I saw that it was totally not working for their data, did I really do my normal design investigation to see what other kinds of forms do I think will work. And in this case, there was not a particular sort of project that defined how the eventual visualization was looking, but really it was more of a, let's see all the kinds of general chart types that we have, and can any of those fit this particular data set, and combine it in a way that their particular data fits together. So it was more basic chart forms than specific projects.
And I mean, you've got one of the most broad and widely varied spectrums of work in the field, but I think one of the common motifs that we do come across in your pieces are these kind of circular radial structures. Is that something that you particularly enjoy working with? Is it something that you often find yourself gravitating towards, where relevant, of course?
Yeah, no, I just really like using sines and cosines.
Right, okay.
I guess it's not something I implement on purpose, but I do guess that on sort of a personal bias level, I am drawn to things that are visualized in a circular way. But I do always try and keep in mind that some things just don't work in a circle, but other things doesn't really mind. And I guess I really just like the symmetry and the compactness of if you put it into a circle versus if you were to lay it out all in a line.
Okay, so moving on to the second stage, where we look at the data, and we look at the data that you had to work with, and the shape, size, the conditions that gave you, opportunities and challenges. First of all, the data acquisition. So I guess the client sent you some data. What was the nature of the data that you were able to kind of work with? Was it just a small sample? Was it a live feed? What was the kind of extent of that?
So this was one of the also rare cases where the client sent over data that really needed very little cleaning or analysis. They sent me a data set that was a data dump. It was a specific time frame of where the operating system had been working. I think maybe a month of data. And I do usually ask for these kind of data dumps. Just give me something that you think covers the breadth and range of values that you think you'll expect. That can either be one data set or multiple data sets. And then I will start to develop from that, and using those kind of edge cases and normal cases, I can then easily switch out the data sets to see how it will look. Usually during the development stage, I don't connect to APIs or to the actual data structure, because more that I don't want to touch that part. I really prefer creating all of my visualizations that I create for clients that will be like interactive visualizations that end up in the client system. I will create them as standalone functions, which will have hooks that they can actually make changes with. But it's really a standalone thing, and they will implement it into their system and hook it up with the right kind of data things that they need. It's more that I don't want to burn my fingers on that part. So please just send me static data, and then I will develop it with that.
And in terms of the shape and the size and the dimensions of the data, this is clearly a kind of hierarchical data set, but one that has different quantities within and statuses within. Can you sort of briefly describe the extent of the data? How many different categories, service areas? What's the most? What was the least? What were some of the kind of characteristics that most stood out for you there?
Yes. So they were, even with these services, all of these, each row of the data that I had was one specific service with when it was created and when it was last updated, any specific comments, and then an ID, and that ID contained information about the different domains that it could be part of, because they had specified, I think, about 6 different domains that a service could fall into, and that could be something as simple as a file transformation kind of service, such as a service that copies a file, all the way to machine learning services, where a service could be an actual machine learning algorithm that does something with the data that gets put into it. And these domains were going to be very important because the client really wanted to be able to distinctly see the different domains and all of the things that were happening in there. However, the thing that made it really complicated in terms of visualizing was the fact that services from one domain could create services in another domain. And that's where actually the hardest part of the design came from. But in terms of data, it was pretty straightforward. There were just sort of 3-4 variables that I had to work with: time, domain, and I guess the unique ID.
And the parent-child relationships, was that fairly stable in terms of there are just the two generations, or were there some where you got 3, 4, 5? Or did you have to kind of just create a cutoff to say we're just going to look at those 2 or 3 levels?
The parent relationship, you could have a child that was like the grandchild of the first service, so it could be 4, 5, 6 levels deep, but it was about that far and not farther. So in that sense, I just started out by including all of the parent-child relationship that were in there, and then when the final visual came about, it turned out that it could actually handle 6 or 7 levels, so I didn't have to cut out anything.
And I guess an extension of this stage is also for you to learn more about the subject itself. To what extent did you feel you had a good grasp of what this topic is? And therefore, to what extent did you also potentially need to speak to the client and have that conversation to learn from the subject matter experts? What is this thing about? You know, what's kind of important about the subject that I might need to then tease out through the design later on?
That was in terms of that, I always ask the client when I start on a project, so what are the main goals? What do people have to learn when they look at this visualization? And they were very clear in that. Actually, I've never had a client that was so clear in that. They really just send me a list of they need to see this and this and this and this. So that made it very easy to figure out how to show that, even though I might not know exactly what all of these domains were actually about. Just knowing that I was looking at a hierarchical data set of services in an operating system calling other services was basically enough for me to move forward, because what they wanted to see was the state of the system, which services have failed, see the cascade of possible fails, and be clearly able to distinguish domains and see crosses from one domain to another. It's like a very bounded off box of things that they wanted.
That's interesting. And I suppose that clarity then makes me wonder, what did they have in place before this? Certainly internally, was there something that you could even build on, even if it was, quite primitive? Was there something that they already had, or was it just a complete empty space that this was filling?
No, it's completely empty. As far as I know, they did not have any kind of visualization in place to assess these things.
Wow, right.
Yeah. Well, they were still pretty new, so they were also in their sort of build up of the startup phase.
I see, understood. So you spoke before about how they came to you with this idea of the constellations, and you at that stage were thinking, yeah, it could be still something that we can pursue. So although there wasn't much exploratory work for you to do to find stories, it was more about the exploration to find design approaches, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
At what point did you recognise that the constellations architecture approach wouldn't work?
After the first save and refresh of my page where the code was working.
Okay. So you didn't spend too much time wasted down that line then. Right, that's good to know.
Yeah, I did try for a little while to see if I could do easy changes and then maybe see if it was going to become better, but I guess deep down inside I knew this was totally failed approach. Right.
Moving on to the kind of editorial section, which is kind of a stage where we have to take that step back and think, okay, what we're going to show, what we're going to leave out. Did you, in the end, so you clearly already had from the client and in your own mind a clear sense of what this had to show, this kind of hierarchical display with critical alerts or status so that those monitoring it can understand what actions need to be taken. But in terms of the actual contents that we see in the NPs, are there things that were actually taken off that or removed from that just couldn't reasonably make it into the final design, or didn't need to be in the final design?
So some of the, I guess, the metadata aspects are not in the final design. If you hover over one of the actual services, that you would be able to see exactly who the parent was and what the service was doing particularly. I mean, even if you see that it's in a domain of machine learning, what is that service actually doing within that domain? That's things that really only came across during a hover. But I guess in the other parts, really just showing the service and showing the parent-child relationships, this and the domains, this all stayed within there. I guess that was an aspect of the data actually being quite simple in terms of there were only 3 or 4 columns. There were just a lot of data points, but they weren't quite very diverse, so it was not hard to almost show everything out of it.
Another aspect of editorial thinking might revolve around the time frame of the data that we see on the current view. Now, are we seeing the now, or is it the recent now? What's the sort of position that we are looking at any given point?
So this is something that I gave as an option to the client. So while I was developing it, I actually implemented a function that would randomly pick a time frame that was either somewhere, I think, between 3 days and 20 days, and that would just show everything in between that. But for the client, I guess the main approach would be to show the now and then back from the now. But I gave the client the option using the visual function to say if backwards should be a day or an hour or 2 weeks, depending on how big and elaborate their eventual system would be. So it's I guess that's not defined. It's the client that gets to pick.
Yeah, and I suppose that there could be a further interesting feature whereby you can imagine sort of zooming into the past to see how the current compares to the past. But I guess again within the purpose and the remit of what this is supposed to do, the now makes loads of sense. So moving on to the design stage then, I'm kind of working through the different elements of the visualization anatomy. First of all, the representation. Can you sort of talk through the encodings, how you arrived at this? I guess you've got a donut chart in the center, and you've got this kind of dendrogram, almost like a connected dendrogram structure. How would you kind of describe it, and what were the encodings that you eventually used?
So the circle, yes, it has an inside, all the way in the center is the metadata. It shows the time frame of all the services that you're seeing. You see the totals for the number of services, so how many are completed, how many are running, how many have failed. Around that is a donut shape where that sections off the different domains that you have. And then the arc length of each of these donut arcs is defined by the number of services that is within each domain. So for example, machine learning has has a big arc because there are a lot of services within that. But for example, maybe the file change domain has very few, so it has a very small arc. And then outside of that, there are the actual services, and they go around in a circle. They are ordered to start at sort of the earliest time frame within the domain. So it's clockwise. If you have a domain, you start with the first service, and then along clockwise you go to the next services that were called. However, if a service was a child of the original parent service, is the first service that got started, if that was a child of that one, it is actually placed right next to its parent, but one level deeper. So say the circle that it's placed on is slightly bigger than the circle of its parent. And if that service in turn has created child services, these are again moved one level deeper, so a slightly bigger circle again. And that's how this sort of structure of the hierarchy in the dendrogram is created. There is one slight difference though, and that is that if a parent service from, say, machine learning creates another service in a different domain than machine learning, that service is actually is also placed outside. So a bigger circle, but it's placed inside the domain that it actually belongs to. And then there's a pretty long line possibly running from the parent to that other service.
And I mean, you mentioned it before, but was that the trickiest thing to include in this?
Yes, the trickiest thing was really being able to keep the domain separated, because in essence, a radial tree would have worked really well with this kind of visualization, because it is basically a tree service, and then the very inside would be the different domains. Then outside of one level outside of that would be the first services, and outside would be the second level of services, and so on. However, you could not. There was no way to make it very clear that a service that started in machine learning and one of these then suddenly became a service that belonged to file changes. There's no way to do that in a radial tree, not that I could think of. So that was really the main problem. This sort of being able to show the hierarchy, but keeping the domains in their separate portions of the visual.
And did you ever think about the linear dendrogram, either the sort of top to bottom or left to right structure, or did that just create this sense of a lack of a whole, where the circle gives you the whole, whereas a linear one is something's over there, they don't feel connected in the same space sometimes?
Yeah, so I went with the so in essence this is almost like a dendrogram going down, but it was more that you cannot quite know beforehand the amount of width that you would need, and I think you would need a lot more width than if you just wrap it around in a circle, where it can stay much more compact and actually even show thousands of data points, but still fit on a laptop screen.
Yeah, and I guess that makes it a bit more responsive to different screen sizes and platform dimensions like that.
Yeah.
With regards to interactive features, the extent of interactivity is, I guess, deliberately relatively limited. You've got the ability to hover to see details, and then you can click on and select certain services or sections. I'm probably using the wrong language. Were there any other features that you considered? We talked before about the idea of changing the time frame, but any other things that you might have ultimately taken off or left out that you could have done?
The actual interactive features, apart from this selecting the domain or hovering over any service, that was really the two main things. There was an extra thing where, just for visual sort of appeal, we wanted it that if a service was running, like a parent, that it would kind of show like little sparks moving towards the children, like it was active, like a neurons in a brain or something, like sparking. That was a very very first idea, but due to the change that we had to do, we had to leave some of these sort of extra things that really didn't have any sort of effect apart from just some fun.
Looking cool.
We had to leave that off.
Is that something you'd revisit if you had the chance? Would you look to try and get that going? I think it's quite a strong concept, actually.
I guess maybe, I don't know. It's also because eventually these lines, they didn't end up as being the lines between parent and child are not simple lines. They're actually sort of lines that are slightly jiggled, and it's like 10 lines drawn on top of each other, slightly jiggled, to mimic the idea of car tail lights, because a lot of the Alice's branding had to do with these long exposure photos of highways. So that's what I wanted to mimic with that. And I think trying to add this on top of that right now wouldn't have quite fitted this design anymore, maybe, or would have made it difficult to do. So I guess I'm still intrigued to see how I would have tackled it visually, but I wouldn't necessarily have added it looking back.
Yeah, no, that's a really nice idea, actually. The notion of the car lights over a long exposure. I was wondering what the slight sense of blur. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but that makes lots of sense now. One of the little details that I always love about these things is the often neglected reset button. So you start navigating through these depths, and then you get to the point of interest. You think, how do I get back to the start? So it's really nice to see the reset button there. In terms of color choices, obviously we've talked about the limitations of the colour palette that you were effectively imposed
Hmm.
with. But I think what's kind of interesting, almost from an editorial point of view, is that everything is this sort of very kind of almost sort of flat, monochromatic colour scheme, and then we've got the blue and the red, and they stand out. Was that therefore perceived to be the most important things to visually emphasise from this structure? This notion of Ubuntu, and if you can explain what that is as well,
Yeah.
and failed. Were they the two key things that needed to be elevated in terms of kind of colour accentuation?
Yes, yes, definitely. Because the knowing what was finished and knowing what was running was all fine, but it really had to draw your eye if something had failed or if something was Ubuntu. And I asked what Ubuntu was, and I might say this wrong, but I believe it means the client told me that it means human in an African language. I've forgotten which one. I'm sorry. But it means that that service now requires a human to look at it and do something, like say okay or make some changes before that service would actually run properly. They are very rare, so while I was creating it, and I started out with like a rainbow of colors, one color for each of the different domains. But once the design sort of progressed, and I came upon this sort of concept of the circle and the depth circle, I saw that actually I didn't, now that every domain was so clearly in its own sort of part of the circle, I didn't need all those colors anymore. And that made it possible to really go back to that black and white and make the red really stand out. I did need that extra color, that blue, which is not in the client's brand guidelines, but they were okay with it. I guess also because it's yeah, I couldn't make it red because then it wouldn't stand out because, from the field services. And like I said, it happens so few. Yeah, it doesn't happen a lot, so it's not a color that you would often see.
So you had to go begging to the client, please give me one more hue to work with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, is there any grayscale? I'm trying to detect if it's quite opaque white or if it's sort of black and various shades of grey.
In all honesty, I don't quite remember. I do know from experience that I prefer working with white and black and using opacities over gray. So I'm guessing it's probably just a faded white.
And what's also very clear, and you spoke about it before, is this kind of glow effect.
Mm.
So that obviously works on the kind of inner donut chart arcs.
Yeah.
And I think I can detect it around the service circles. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. So there's definitely a glow going on in these parts of the visual. There's also, especially if you have the running surfaces, they glow even brighter to really give this idea of it's on. And the same
Right.
for the failed surfaces, they're glowing very brightly red, as if it's like a red light in the darkness. And again, this was defined by inspiration from those long exposure photos where you'd see these lights and they would be kind of blurry, and I wanted to capture that feeling in this visual by adding this glow. That was really, like I said in the start, that was really that step of trying to add the design flair on top of just the visual form of a circle.
Absolutely. Um, with regards to annotation next, obviously it's quite limited in the amount of
Yeah.
annotations on here, other than the central space that's given up to the key labeling. There's no user guide, there's no title, there's no introduction. So I guess that would be quite a departure from a lot of the projects that you do normally work on, where you do accompany lots of assistance for the reader. Was there anything that you could have included that was eventually just left off? Were you under this? I'm going back to the idea that this also has to be an aesthetic, attractive, appealing device. Were there things that could usually be included, but to preserve that aesthetic quality, you actually took them off in the end?
Yeah, so one thing that I could have included is a legend that would say, like, what does a black circle or a white circle or red circle, blue circle actually mean? We did leave that off because, again, the people looking at this primarily would be experts, so they know what it means. I did try and sort of indirectly add it partly using the central part that shows the overview of the system. So how many running, how many failed by making the failed one is red. The text of failed is red. The text of running is white. But yeah, it's just that you have this sort of black feel, and their website is completely black as well, with this sort of white circle in it, and it just felt like such a how do you say it right? Like, it just didn't look nice to have anything outside of that circle. You really wanted to have this sort of the symmetry of the circle on this blackness.
Yeah, I agree. I think that kind of containing everything within that central area is aesthetically just a sensible treatment. I'm also, so I guess the typeface choice would have been part of the style guideline, but I'm the little details here. But I'm kind of interested in the variety of fonts within there. So you've got some that are bold, some that are large, some that are small, some that are regular. How much iteration of those different levels of fonts did you go through? Because I just find myself bouncing around so many different variations. I find it hard to work out, right, that's the best one.
Yes. Oh, I have the same thing. It almost helped here that I knew which font I had to go for, because otherwise I would go through like 20, 30 different font choices. And there were definitely, I typically try a bunch of things, like at least a dozen different kinds of different ways to combine bold with normal. Generally, I do try and use bold for things like titles or things such as labels. So the domain names might either be bold or they're bigger or they're uppercase. And then having, I guess, the things that are more textual, such as maybe the labels. So in a legend, they might be regular. So I do have some thoughts in my head from the start what I would actually do, but still I do try and just try, sometimes even just randomly set things to bold and other things to regular, just to see how it looks. Sometimes you can be surprised and say, well, actually this does work in this way, which I would not have rationally thought of.
Yeah, and sometimes it's that fingertip sense of that's it.
Yeah.
Leave it.
Yeah. Although sometimes it's more like, I'm not sure, but this is just gonna be it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes these things have just got equal merits, and it's just say, right, just decide.
Exactly.
Another little feature that I noticed, and something that I always struggle with, is the labels, the 2-digit labels against the arcs. Some are sort of aligned in terms of their orientation to the center, some aligned to the outside, sort of optimum readability of the 2 digits. How did you manage that? So, for example, I'm looking at PT versus ML.
Mm-hmm.
ML points towards the line, PT points towards the center. How did you kind of just reconcile that design challenge of sort of readability of the labels?
Yes, so readability of labels in the circular layout is something I've been coming across for a long time. And typically what I do is anything where the text is, if you have a circle and the text is at the bottom half of the circle, it will be sort of upward, and if it's on the top half of the circle, it would be kind of flipped, so that it's always trying to make it as much upright as possible.
Right.
Makes the coding a little bit more complex, but I almost have I wrote a tutorial on actually how to do it, so usually I go back to that and then
solve it once and solve it forever. Yeah, absolutely. And we've spoken obviously about the kind of the architecture being this sort of radial display, and I think again that occupies the space so elegantly. Again, ticking this box of an aesthetic device, an attractive, almost data art piece, but then still being fundamentally, functionally useful. So that all makes lots of sense. I mean, reflecting across all the design choices that you ended up with, are there any that you feel that you'd like to revisit, or given different circumstances you would look to treat in a different way?
Well, this project was so tricky to find like a visual form that I felt would do justice to the data, that I exhausted all of the thoughts that I had, all of the things that I wanted to try, and it was this or I don't know. And sometimes I do have other ideas, but in this case this was my last straw.
Absolutely, been there before. So looking back over the sort of production of the piece itself, technology, throughout the process, what were the tools, the applications, the libraries that you used from the data stage right the way through to the end production?
Yeah, so I always start with R to do my data preparation. So I loaded the data set into R that I got from the client to do some very light restructuring of the data that I needed for the visualization. Then I created the visualization on the web. And in this case, because I knew that we would be dealing with a lot of circles, a lot of surfaces, I created it using the HTML5 Canvas API, which is something you can use to draw to like a canvas on the screen. It's very different from SVG that people on the web usually use to draw things with. And naturally, for me at least, I use D3, which is a JavaScript library that is one of the standards on the web to visualize data with, to really help me structure some of the data beforehand again, and to create things like the donut chart, which are very easy to create with some of the functions in D3. I use Visual Studio Code as my code editor. I typically use Chrome to, together with the DevTools, to inspect my visualization as it's going, and I have a live reload going, so that means that I can usually stay within the code editors, press save, and then the browser will reload automatically, so I don't actually have to move between the different two, which if you have to do that like 200 times a day can be kind of annoying. And that's because the visual is really a visual function that stays on the web. That's really where it ended up as well. It's really so R and web.
That's the extent. Fantastic. Yep. So reflecting overall on first of all, the project's feedback, effectiveness, success. Did you get any anecdotal feedback from the client about its value, its usage?
Yes, actually, with this one, I always forget to ask, but with this one, actually, I did, and I got some really nice feedback back, and I have the email right over here. So this was in April, so that was a few months later, and they say, we've been using your visual for more than 3 months in production, and it has become an integral part of our team. All of my team members have it open on one of their screens all the time. So that was great. And then they also said, he goes on, but something else that I really enjoyed that he said is what made this different than our other outsourced jobs is that you went through the process of coming up with a visual that works instead of implementing a visual we had in mind. So implementing a solution is completely different than coming up with a solution, and you help with the latter. So that was,
well, that's very
I was
nice.
really happy with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so reflecting personally, how did you enjoy the experience? Did you feel that you handled the project efficiently? Obviously, there's clear evidence that it was effective, but how do you look back over this project now?
Yeah, I really, it's in terms of the sort of how happy I am with the end result is one of my better projects in that sense. There are still things that annoy me, and that is usually performance and interaction. If the visual can actually update, so say that the client has said the time frame should be a day, and you get new services and others move out of it, or if you go to a different domain, the visual, all of these circles start moving about and rearranging themselves. And that kind of stutters if there is too many circles visible, and that really just irks me until I don't know. It's either cannot be done, or I think it's more a question of like that's where my technological knowledge really that's where it ended. I couldn't make that better, and I wish I could have done that, make the animation more smooth, but. Other than that, it's a project that I look back on with having a lot of fun, good client interactions. It was challenging at the start when I didn't know how this was going to end up, but somehow it did.
Fantastic, yeah. I mean, I guess there's always at least one itch left to scratch at the end of a project. So if that's the extent, then I think you've done fairly well. So that's wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Nadi, for going through that. It's been really interesting insight to the process, the obstacles that you face, but actually just the successful project solution that you arrived at as expressed by the client there. So thank you so much for that insight. Tune in, everyone out there. to the next episode of Explore Explain. See you next time.
To see more information about today's episode, including links to the key sites and resources mentioned, visit my website at visualizingdata.com. You'll also find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing and spreading the word. See you next time. Explore Explain is a Matt Nods interactive production.